Hosea chapter 9, we're going to start in verse 16, sort of. I'm going to back up a little bit on verse 15, because I don't think I finished that. I stopped in the middle of it. Let me read 15 again. Chapter 9, verse 15. Because of all their wickedness in Gilgal, I hated them there. Because of their sinful deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will no longer love them. All their leaders are rebellious. All right, we talked about the rebellion at Gilgal. Two things happened there. One was that is where they established a human monarchy. You know, God wanted them to have judges. They said, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. And that's where they inaugurated their first king. The other thing that happened there was a spiritual rebellion at the shrine of Baal. We went through that. I'm not going to go through that. But what happened was God says, I'm going to hate them, and I'm not going to love them any longer. And I'm going to drive them out of my house. And what he's talking about, out of my house, he means out of the land of Israel. I'm going to drive them out of the land of Israel. That's a pretty serious thing God says he's going to do, when he's going to drive them out of the land. It's a word that means to drive out or cast out. But it's more like having something to do with being forcibly removed. I'm going to drive you out. I'm going to grab you by the nape of the neck, and I'm going to drag you out. That's what he's talking about. I'm going to drive you out. There's not going to be any choice in the matter. It's the same word that was used in Genesis 3:4 when he drove Adam and Eve out of the garden. They didn't have any choice in the matter. They were driven out. It's the same word that was used of Cain. After he killed Abel, what did God do with Cain? He drove him out. It's the same word. He was forcibly removed from it. His family, the people he knew, the people he loved, the places he was familiar with, he drove him out of that. He said, you're going to wander the land for the rest of your days, right? Something like that. And the other thing was Hagar and Ishmael. They were cast out in Genesis 24:10. It's the same word used there. Those three groups, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, when he says, I'm going to drive you out of the land of Israel, that's the kind of thing he's talking about. You're leaving, and you're not going to have any choice in the matter. So now, Israel's going to be driven out. This will all happen because of the wickedness, and meaning they have become like those people at Gilgal. Because you have become like them, I'm going to drive you out. So that's what verse 15 looks like. Verse 16, let me read 16. Chapter 9, verse 16. Ephraim is blighted. Now remember, Ephraim is the primary portion. It's the largest tribe, the largest land area, the most predominant tribe of the northern kingdom. And so sometimes when we say Ephraim, we're really talking about the entire, it's used as I don't know if it's metaphor's right, an idiom for the whole country. It's like saying Texas and you mean the whole United States. So Ephraim is blighted, their root is withered, they yield no fruit. Even if they bear children, I will slay their cherished offspring. The withering root, there's no hope for the future. When the root dies, what happens? Nothing comes back. You cut a plant off even with the top of the ground. If the root's still intact, it can grow. But this root is withering. There's to have no hope for the future. Ironically, because of widespread sterility and infant mortality, Ephraim wants a symbol of fruitfulness would now be compared to a withering root, incapable of bearing fruit. All right, so verse 17 was one we talked about a little bit last week when we talked about the verse of the week. We're not going to talk about that verse again, but we'll talk about verse 17 a little bit differently. Verse 17 says, "My God will reject them because they have not obeyed him. They will be wanderers among the nations." All right, my God will reject them because they have not obeyed him. They will be wanderers among the nations. Because of their disobedience, Israel would be rejected by God. He always has a good and valid reason, and it is usually, maybe always, disobedience on many levels. When he rejects something, it's because of disobedience. And they will be wanderers among the nations. They're going to be taken over. We know where they're going to be taken over by Assyria. Assyria takes them into captivity. Then they pick them up. With all nations, they pick up that nation and move somewhere else. And where they move them to, they take those people and move them somewhere else. So they're deported, but they end up being, what's a good word for it? Yeah, their bloodlines gets, if they should happen to intermarry, their family trees get all fouled up. We talked about that a little bit last week. They have been wanderers since this time until 1948. They had no homeland. And the wandering Jew has been an idiom throughout secular literature. There's a type of plant called a wandering Jew. I've got two different kinds of it in my flower bed at home. Have you ever heard of it? It goes everywhere. It wanders. It's this long vine, and it grows, and it just goes everywhere. And it's called a wandering Jew. And it got the name of that plant from the way the Jews of the northern kingdom wandered. So anyway, so they will be wanderers among the nations. All right, so that's the end of chapter 9. Oh, not quite all. In this case, the punishment fits the crime. Those who willfully strayed from the path of the covenant loyalty, which is the Israelites, will be condemned to wander among those outside of the covenant. They had the covenant, they rejected the covenant, now they're going to be deported to a land where nobody ever had the covenant. So it's kind of a justice kind of thing. So we're going to talk about chapter 10 now, which has got a lot of interesting things in it. Verse 1, Israel was a spreading vine. He brought forth fruit for himself. As his fruit increased, he built more altars. As his land prospered, he adorned his sacred stones. So the vine has been used throughout the Bible as a metaphor for Israel. But the sad part is that it's an idiom for them as being degenerate. It starts out, they're always discussed as God being set in the ground, planted in the ground by God with one purpose for them, and they end up being something else. They were planted to give good fruit. They end up giving bad fruit. In every case that I know of, it's that way. And they're talking about here as being a spreading vine or a luxuriant vine. A good example of that situation where they're a vine intended to be good and end up being bad is in Isaiah 5, verse 1 through 7. I don't know if y'all have ever read that. Let me just read it to you real quick. It's kind of an interesting thing. Isaiah 5. Starts out good. I will sing to the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it, and he cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes. What do you think the next phrase is? He found bad grapes. He looked for good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and men in Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? That is interesting. God gets to a point where he says, what else can I do? That's where he was with the northern kingdom. He says, when I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and the hedge is the protection, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. And then he goes on and on. So that's just one example of the vine. Started out with the intent, God had the intent of it being a great thing, having a great nation, Israel, and it always turns out to be just the opposite of what the intent was. So the northern kingdom has been unusually prosperous. Here they are, back to Hosea again, here they are described as a spreading vine or a luxuriant vine in some translations, which on the surface sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty prosperous, luxuriant, spreading. They're able to expand. The problem is, as with any vine which spreads out too far, there's a destructive nature to it. I've got a couple of cantaloupe vines that came up in our garden. I didn't plant them where they came up. They came up right next to a tomato plant. Those vines ran all over those tomatoes. Great, we're going to have cantaloupe. The problem is it destroyed the tomatoes right next to it. If you have a vine that's in your flower bed and you let it get out of the flower bed over your grass, what does it do? It'll kill the grass. So spreading and luxuriant looking is not always a good thing. It may be a bad thing, as it is in this case. What has happened with the northern kingdom, their prosperity has been attributed to Baal, even though it was provided by Yahweh, and they built more and more altars to Baal. As they were successful, they attributed more and more to Baal, they built more and more altars. Similarly, for their sacred stones, which are monuments to various idols. So the idea here is that the further they go into prosperity, they are sinking further and further into spiritual unfaithfulness to Yahweh. So the more prosperous they get, the further away they get from Yahweh. All right, verse 2. Their heart is deceitful. Now, this is an interesting verse. Their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will demolish their altars and destroy their sacred stones. All right, I've got 5 different translations for that word, deceitful. The NIV says deceitful, or my version of NIV does. King James says divided. CSB says devious. The ESV says false. Is that right? NASB says faithless. Okay? All coming from the same word. The same word is this. Chalak. It means divided or shared. Now we're talking about a heart that is divided or shared. So it's real easy to see where we're going with this. We're talking about worshiping God, but how do you worship God with a heart that you share with Baal? You've got a heart that's divided. I'm forever going to be going back to Jeremiah 17, verse 9 and 10. Y'all have that, just flip over there. It was our verse of the week one time. Jeremiah 17, 9 and 10. This should be one we commit to memory. The heart is deceitful above all things. Now they had deceitful hearts. That's what we were talking about. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward a man according to his conduct, according to what his deeds deserve. In order to reveal the deceptiveness and the falseness in their thinking, God will hold them accountable. He's kind of just let them run wild, gave them what they wanted. But there comes a time when God has to act, and He's going to act, and He's going to act in a way where He holds them accountable for their actions. That's the way God is. I think Jeremiah 17:9 and 10 shows the deceptive nature of the heart. With prosperity, these people of the northern kingdom have deceived themselves into thinking that it all came not from Yahweh, but from Baal. They're prosperous, so your prosperity you attribute to whoever you want to attribute it to, right? You might not attribute it to anybody but yourself. Look what I did, right? Well, they got away from God, and we're going to talk about that more, believe it or not, as we go here. But they were attributing everything to Baal, so they had this divided heart. Those same verses say that God knows, in Jeremiah, say that God knows the deceptive nature of the heart. And now in Hosea 10, verse 2, he says he will take away their prosperity and abundance of chapter 10, verse 1, and he will destroy their false religion of verse 2. I'm going to take away your prosperity of verse 1, and I'm going to destroy your religion of verse 2. That's what he said. He said, I'm going to destroy your sacred stones. God is a just and righteous God, and He cannot, nor will He, stand by forever and not punish sin. It looks like God gets to a point where we say He's not going to act. He's not going to do anything. But we all know that He does not tolerate our disobedience forever. There is a time where He will act, and He's letting them know that their time has come. We are all responsible for our guilt. And when I say guilt, I do not mean guilty feelings. I mean guilt. If you commit a crime, you go into court, you're found guilty. Doesn't matter whether you got guilty feelings or not about it, you are guilty. There's a big difference in guilty feelings and being guilty. So we're all responsible for the guilt of our false faithfulness toward God. As a quick note, get back to the lament psalms. We never get very far back before we studied. As a quick note back to lament psalm verse 86, I want to read 86:11 to you. I think you'll remember this. Psalm 86:11. It's David. He says, "Teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name." David knew the propensity, David knew the propensity of the heart to be divided, and he asked God to give him something that is not humanly possible to have. An undivided heart. It is not humanly possible to have an undivided heart. David knew God. He knew what God expected of him, but yet he still had problems. Until we see Jesus, we're always going to have divided hearts. Maybe less and less division as we go and come into further understanding and relationship with God. But David knew the propensity of the heart to be divided. He asked God to give him one that was not divided. We cannot share our heart with God and anything else and still be godly. Ephesians 5:5. Uh, we keep I keep talking about that, but it shows the result of having greed, for example, makes making us idolatrous. If we are greedy, we are idolatrous. We put something before God, and that would be our love for money. That's what greed is, right? It's love for money. And he lists off a couple of other things. He lists off, for example, makes us an idolatrous. Even if we are perfect in it, have perfect relationship with God in every other way, if we are greedy, we are idolatrous. That's what you have to remember. No matter how perfect you are, if you have these other things that make you idolatrous, you are idolatrous and you have a divided heart. And he lists off some other things there: adultery, sexual immorality, and impurity of any kind. There's an interesting thing that I've learned here at the village church. Uh, the impurity and the sexual immorality covers adultery, pornography. They said that here at the village, they have said from the pulpit that pornography is the number one addiction. Have you heard Matt Chandler say it? The number one addiction in the country is pornography, more than anything else. That's impurity. Homosexuality is another one. So we must take up our cross daily. We said it last week and before. We must take up our cross daily, commit to Christ daily if we are serious about our worship of Him. These things cannot coexist with Christ in our life and still lead godly lives. All right, verse 3. This is a kind of interesting. I have to give back Kenny's paraphrase of this verse. That's the best I can do. So let me just try. Verse 3. Then they will say, we have no king, but because we did not revere the Lord. But even if we had a king, what could he do for us? Then. That's the easiest part of this verse. Then. After the religious institutions of verse 2 have been destroyed. After that has happened, then this stuff is going to happen. God, let's see. After the religious institutions of verse 2 have been destroyed by God through Assyria, they will also have lost their monarchy through Assyria, so that there will be no king for them. They will not have a king. Not only will they not have a religious institution, they're not going to have a king either. And as a result of the loss of both, the religion and the monarchy, they will recognize that it all happened because they did not revere the Lord. It may take decades, centuries after that for them to realize that, but that's what they're going to realize. But also because their hearts are so cold and they have no knowledge of God, as we know from chapter 4, verse 1, who is actually their divine king. They have no knowledge of God, who is actually their divine king. They still have no faith that even God could do anything for them. That's one hairy verse to try to figure out what it's talking about. They're gonna lose their monarchy, and they're gonna lose their king. They're gonna lose their nation. Lost their land. They lost their homeland. That means they have lost everything. The value of their money. Their money, if they had paper money, it would be valueless. But all their gold rings, their gold necklaces, their gold headdresses, their earrings, their gold plates that they got at home, their silverware made out of gold and silver, and all of those things are gone. They have lost everything. And they said, but what if we had lost our king? What could he even do for us anyway? That's the plight that they're in. They've lost it all. Verse 4. They make many promises, take false oaths, and make agreements. Therefore, lawsuits spring up like poisonous weeds in a plowed field. Just take that word lawsuits and we're going to change it to something else. It doesn't really apply here. They make false promises, they make false oaths, and they make false agreements. Whatever they could get away with, whatever agreement they could break, whatever agreement they could bend to their advantage is what they would do. That's in business, but this has to do with false promises and oaths to God. They fail to confess their failure before God, so injustice, that's the word for lawsuits instead of lawsuits. So injustice is springing up like poisonous weeds rather than the beautiful grapevine of verse 1. That's where they are. They can say anything, they can do anything without regard to God in any way. So rather than that beautiful, luxuriant, prosperous grapevine they talked about in verse 1, they turned it into a poisonous weed patch. All right, verse 5. The people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Bethaven. Its people will mourn over it, and so will its idolatrous priests, those who had rejoiced over its splendor, because it is taken from them into exile. This is kind of interesting. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, is the capital of the northern kingdom, so it is used metaphorically to represent the entire northern kingdom. Sometimes they say Ephraim, sometimes they say Ephraim, sometimes they say Israel, sometimes they say the northern kingdom, sometimes they say Samaria. It all means the same thing in this writing. When we see here the devotion and deep commitment to the golden calf, I cannot understand this. I cannot relate to it, and because I can't relate to it, it's hard for me to teach it. They have two golden calves. When they split the nation into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, created two golden calves, and they apparently have developed this deep devotion to it. And the people and the idolatrous priests at the time rejoiced over its splendor. What a great idol we've got. But now they mourn over their loss because it has been taken into exile. The calf has been taken, this calf has been taken into exile. How do you take something like that into exile? So they just crate it up, carry it off. You know what I wondered about while I was preparing this lesson? What did Assyria think it was? It's gold. But they were an idolatrous nation. But they must have looked at that God like it really wasn't very strong. It couldn't protect the people. I'm thinking they probably took it up there and made plates out of it. Melted it down, make gold silverware or something. I can't think of any other use for it, so I don't know how they put it in exile. But nevertheless, verse 6 says this. Verse 6 says this. It will be carried to Assyria as tribute for the king. Now this is more like it. Tribute for the great king. Ephraim will be disgraced. Israel will be ashamed of its wooden idols. Assyria took it as tribute. That's what they're going to do now. They got it up there as tribute. Now they can melt it down and do what they want. Make plates out of it. Make earrings, whatever they want to do. They're going to have it as tribute for the king. They're not going to treat it as a very powerful God because it couldn't protect Israel. I think it says here that the people were ashamed and disgraced. I think they were ashamed and disgraced by the weakness of their God. I thought we had a good thing going with the golden calf. But the first thing that happens in war, when one nation takes over, one army takes over another army, they start with the mocking. And we talked all through the lament psalms about that. the harassing and the making fun of everybody and degrading comments and all that. And they had to put up with that too. But I think they were at the very least, ashamed and disgraced by the weakness of their God. Verse 7 says, Samaria and its king will float away like a twig on the surface of the waters. Like the exile of the calf, Samaria, which is the whole northern kingdom, and its leadership will float away like a twig floating on the water. It's been destroyed. It's just going to float away. Not only will Yahweh destroy the calf, but he will destroy the northern kingdom and its king, as promised in chapter 4, verse 5 and 6. We've been talking about the promise to destroy this nation almost from the beginning. Now it's going to happen. They had no purpose and no valid doctrine. Not only did they not have valid knowledge of God, we talked about that chapter. I come back to this chapter 4, verse 1 said they had no faith, no truthfulness, they had no covenant love, and they had no knowledge of God. They had no knowledge of God. Not only did they not have any valid knowledge of God, but when they had a chance to have it, they rejected it. All right, verse 8. The high places of wickedness will be destroyed. It is the sin of Israel. Thorns and thistles will grow up and cover their altars. They will say to the mountains and to the hills, fall on us. The sin of Israel. When somebody sins, who do they sin against? God. You don't sin against man. You sin against God. You violate the law of God. So the sin of Israel is a sin against God. Remember David? He had this affair with Bathsheba. Nathan comes in and confronts him with this parable of some sort, and David embarrasses himself with it. And what he said at the end of that was, speaking to God, he says, I have sinned against you and only you. He said, against you and only you have I sinned. That's a big surprise to everybody. He didn't sin against Bathsheba. He didn't sin against the family of Bathsheba. He sinned only against God. So this sin of Israel is a sin against God. When Jeroboam set up the golden calf, it was supposed to represent Yahweh, I suppose. But Baal was also represented by a bull. So you got two cows there, represented two gods. So you can see how easily the worship of each got confused and eventually commingled with each other. So they were worshiping both of them at the same time. It's almost like they were worshiping them as one God. So not only was Yahweh misrepresented by an image of a calf, but his identity among the people was also lost in the commingling of worship practices with Baal. You go to church, you see there's two calves up there. One's Yahweh, supposedly, and one of them is Baal. And they start doing their worship practices. They worship Yahweh, worship Baal, and I can just see them. They start moving them closer together. They're just doing them all the same way. So clearly the second commandment is broken, leading to the sin of Israel. That's what the sin of Israel was. All right. Now with, what verse is that? Verse 8? Yeah. It just goes on and on in my notes. Now with weakness and lack of any strength or resolve of the calf, the captive people of the northern kingdom finally see the impotence of their God. Our God, our golden calf, the one that was going to protect us, is impotent. He has no strength and power whatsoever. The worship places are deserted. and filled, as it says here, the worship places are deserted and filled with thorns and thistles, and the people want to die because of their misplaced worship with their God. God, lower G. I see nowhere that their faith turns to Yahweh. They want to be hidden by being covered by rock. Isn't that what it said? They want the mountains to cover us, to fall on us. It's exactly like Revelation 6:15. Exactly. When they cried out for the rocks to fall on them, to hide them from a God, is what it said in Revelation 6:15. Just fall on us and hide us from God. When all they had to do was repent and show faith in the Lamb, but they wouldn't do it. Not even then. In the face of a falling mountain, they wouldn't repent then either. As it has always been, okay, you want to get a rough paraphrase of Proverbs 14:12? As it has always been, people who think they know what is right continue to stay on that same old, weary, worn path and find at the end of it there is nothing but death. That's the way they were. They refuse. In Revelation, they refuse to repent. These people, I see no way they're repenting here. Verse 9 says, "Since the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel, and there you have remained. Did not war overtake the evildoers in Gibeah?" Remember Gibeah? What happened there? Chopped up this woman, sent her out. Pony Express, I guess. Gibeah was talked about last week, if y'all remember the story. But Hosea says, there's where you still remain. You were like the people of Gibeah, is what they said. They were so evil and wicked. There's this really gory story, Eva, that we talked about a Levite traveling this countryside with his concubine, trying to get back home, and he couldn't get home. So he stopped over in this town, and push came to shove, and the townspeople, the men of the town, ended up taking this concubine out, keeping her out all night, using her up, taking her back to the house dead. The Levite cut the woman up into 12 pieces. Have you ever read this story? You never have you? It's in the Bible. I proved it. We looked at it. It's not something you really want to talk about over lunch, but Jan and I did. But he sent those 12 pieces out to the 12 tribes, wanting to shock them, and it led them into a war where the tribe of Benjamin was almost wiped out. I think only 600 men were left, and so it's just this long, gory story. But he said there was so much wickedness and violence there. He says, you are like they were. And now he's saying, and you're still there. You have not changed. You still have, he said, there you have remained, meaning you still have the same mindset. They relied on military power and violence rather than faith in God, and that's where you are too. All right. That's a fast run through of that. Verse 10. Verse 10, when I please, I will punish them. Nations will be gathered against them to put them in bonds for their double sin. When I please, I will punish them. We'd like to say, how do you put up with that, God? About anything. Drug dealers in our country, gun violence in our country. I mean, it happens every day now. And we go back to chapter 4, verse 2, when he said, not only do you have the three things in verse 1, which is truth and faithfulness, covenant love, and no knowledge of God, but he said in verse 2, all you have is, and he lists off a few things there, murder is one of them. That murder is not that every single person is a murderer, but there is a culture of murder in the land. It just happens. It's like right now. You get in a fight in a bar at 1 o'clock in the morning, by 2 o'clock in the morning when the bar closes down, you're fuming, drunk and fuming, you run out to your car, and the first thing you want to do is to shoot the guy that you were fighting with, arguing with. Now these guys are nuts, chasing people down and shooting them all over the place with AR-15s. It's a culture of murder in our country. That's what we're talking about, even though it was probably even more widespread in the days of the Northern Kingdom. There's a culture of murder. So anyway, you would say, how do you put up with that, God? Well, God is sovereign, and everything works on His timetable according to His plans and His purposes. Here He says, God through Assyria will act because of Israel's double sin. Who knows what the double sin is? I listed down four choices of what the double sin is. The first one I ran across was the inauguration of the king of Saul. Remember we talked last week? The scripture and it indicated that God thought it was evil to have a king. Inauguration of the king and the character of the kings of the northern kingdom. That was sinful. They did not have one decent king in the entire existence of the northern kingdom. Another choice could be they had two golden calves. It's called a double sin, right? Yeah, a double sin. So you got two things. They had two golden calves, so it's real easy to see how that could be a double sin. Another choice might be 2 times people sinned in Gibeah. There was the infamous story we've been talking about, but also something related to Saul was in Gibeah. I think he had a palace there. So if this was a sin, then anything related to Saul is going to be a sin. The fourth choice that I saw was idol worship and trust in the military might rather than God. So you got, who knows what it is? I couldn't get anybody to tell me what it is. This is what I came up with reading. They had some double sin. So your choice is as good as mine, your guess is as good as mine. But those are all 4 sets of double sins, and they all fit. But some of them seem to fit better than more. If you say a double sin, it would mean maybe a sin that is the same thing done 2 ways, like 2 golden calves, or idol worship, where you're not worshiping God, and down here you're trusting in your military other than God. So any way you can see it, they're probably all 4 going to fit some way or another. Okay, verse 11. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh, so I will put a yoke on her fair neck. I will drive Ephraim. I will drive Ephraim. Judah must plow, and Jacob must break up the ground. Okay, he switches from that agricultural metaphor of the grapevine now to farm animals. And he talks about having a good heifer. Didn't he say, or a trained heifer, or a good heifer? Yeah, trained calf. Trained is a good one. It's already broken in on how to plow the ground. Huh? That's a big. He what? Looks. Yeah. And when we see what that really is talking about, is really impressive. It's going to be talking about relationship with God. Okay. What? If you go down to where it talks about breaking up the ground, I think it was. It's talking about fallow. The better translation is fallow ground. Fallow ground. All right, this is talking about unplowed. Mine said unplowed. It doesn't say it. But it's actually talking about fallow ground. When it's breaking up the ground, you're talking about breaking up fallow ground. Fallow ground, I think two different translations call it fallow ground. The King James and the New American Standard. Does that say fallow ground in verse 11? Okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, well, fallow ground is ground that has been prepared for planting. It's been plowed, it's ready to be planted, and then it's just left unattended. So that and it's left unattended for a long enough period where if you want to use it, you got to go back and plow it again. That's the kind of ground we're talking about here. God knows, we'll go on with it, but God knows the ground, which is their prior relationship, it has been left unattended and it had become like fallow ground. Now he wants that once well-trained heifer to begin to the difficult work of plowing the fallow ground, which is a metaphor for their unattended relationship with God. So what they want to do, like Wayne said, this heifer loves to do this work. What they're going to want to do, what God wants them to do, is redo that land, redo that relationship, and get it going again. And that heifer, that trained heifer, looks forward to doing that every day. Hard work it is, but he looks forward to it. She looks forward to it every day. Okay, verse 12. Yeah, there's where the fallow ground is, but it's the same thing. He says, in verse 12 it says, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unplowed ground or your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers righteousness on you. So what? Sow righteousness. Reap what? Reap unfailing love. This is covenant love, that love which God abandoned in his relationship with them. Remember, he said real often in the beginning of our study, he said, I don't love you anymore. He abandoned that love. So when you sow righteousness, you will reap the benefit of that love again. Why? You reap, that's exactly right. It's everywhere. Why? Prepare yourself, for it is time to seek the Lord. Now, he said it's time to seek the Lord. I have thought about that verse. I've been thinking about that all week. If we look at for it's time to seek the Lord. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 1 and 2 says this, as God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. That is not what I thought this verse said. I tell you, here it is. Here's the rest of the verse. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. That last part of the verse. Now is the time of God's grace. Now is the day of salvation. Don't squander his grace. Today is the day of salvation. And that's what he's talking about here when he says, sow righteousness, reap unfailing love, break up the unfailing ground. It is time to seek the Lord. And I just thought, don't squander God's grace. But what happened is verse 13 is something totally different. Verse 13 says, but you have planted wickedness. He just said, sow righteousness. But he said, you planted wickedness. You have reaped evil. So there you go, sow and reap again, Wayne. You have eaten the fruit of deception because you have depended on your own strength and on your many warriors. So, unfortunately, they squandered God's grace. They sowed wickedness and reaped evil. Their divided heart of verse 2 has deceived them again. They have eaten the fruit of deception. They cannot get past doing what seems right in their own eyes. And and they end up eating the fruit of deception. You have depended on your own strength, which is your enemy. And I say your own strength with a very loose definition of the word strength, for we have no strength apart from God. This is more like your own ways rather than strength. You have depended on your own ways rather than the strength. You get real strength from God. God says He does what He wants, when He wants, and how He wants to do it. And if you go to Isaiah 46, verse 9 and 10, 9 through 11, you see that nothing can stop Him either. So, verse 14, let's look at verse 14. And the roar of battle will rise against your people, so that all your fortresses will be devastated, as Shalman devastated Beth Arbel on the day of battle, when mothers were dashed to the ground with their children. There's a lot of darkness in the Old Testament. Because of their trust in their army, God will use Assyria to devastate the people and their military strength, and He will do it as Shalman devastated Beth Arbel. Beth Arbel. There was a war, there was a battle fought where Shalman, which I think was probably one of the kings of Assyria, took on Beth Arbel and defeated them. And that Beth Arbel, I can't even get commentaries to agree where it is. Some of them says north of the Sea of Galilee, east of the Sea of Galilee. Some of them said it was west of the Sea of Galilee, but it's right around there in the area of the Sea of Galilee. There were terrible atrocities there where the women and their children were thrown off a cliff. It's not in the Bible. Not in our Bible. I think that's in the Maccabees. But he said, what happened there is going to happen to you. That's what he says in verse 15. He says, thus will it happen to you, O Bethel, because your wickedness is great. When that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed. So that battle that I just talked about, where the women and their babies and their teenage daughters and their teenage sons were thrown off a cliff as part of the evilness and the wickedness of the Assyrians against that group of people, he says in 15, the same thing is going to happen to you, O Bethel. Bethel is where one of those golden calves was. And he's saying, because of where that golden calf is, this is going to happen to you. The wickedness is great part of that verse is really more like extreme wickedness or absolute evil, something like that. It's more than just your wickedness is great. I don't know what y'all's translation says about that in verse 15, but it says, here again it says, because your wickedness is great, because your wickedness is extreme, because your wickedness is absolute. That's pretty absolute. Talking about Bethel, where the golden calf is. When that day dawns, there's going to be a day when that's going to happen to you. And when that day dawns, meaning when the battle begins, at dawn, your king is going to be destroyed first thing that morning. It's rough. He's comparing, you have to be up on the Old Testament. You have to be up on history to really adequately study the Old Testament, because there's lots of stuff that you need to go, because we saw it in Jude. He's always going back to the Old Testament, saying if you're not careful, you're going to be like this. Here they're saying, here's what happened here, and because you're just the same way and haven't changed, the same thing is going to happen to you. It goes back in time. Here's what happened. now this is going to happen to you, the same thing. So that's the end of chapter 15. Chapter 10. If we get to chapter 11 next week, we're going to see a decidedly different tone. We're not going to be talking about women and children getting thrown off of cliffs. We're going to be talking about something totally different. So we'll go to chapter 11 next week.